and welcome back to the Beer Ladies podcast. I am Katie, I am your host today, and this episode is all about beer and Vikings. Wah! So, with me this week we have Christina, we have Thandi, and we have Lisa. Ladies, say hello.
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 And I want to tell you all that this is our season finale. Woo! We are going to be taking a summer break and we will be back to you towards the end of August. We will still be around and we might be doing little road trips around the country, maybe overseas when we're allowed. We'll still be around, but we just won't be producing new content for a little while. So before we start anything at all, I'm going to say, ladies, what are we drinking? So I'm going to start with Christina, because you're right beside me on my screen.
So I was really fortunate to do a Lithuanian or be on a Lithuanian beer talk with Beerfest. And as part of that, Canvas Brewing sent me a bunch of beers. And one of the beers that they sent was this Liminal Barrel 26 Flemish Red, which is 6.9% Asian wine barrels with a hint of cherry notes furthering the fruitiness. It's a gorgeous beer. Like it's just, I mean, it's very, very, very well done. And I'm actually going to talk about another one of their beers later on today, which is the Smoke Red Ale, which has all of the ingredients and energy were sourced on the farm. So that's really cool, but we'll talk more about that later and why I'm going to talk about it. But the Flemish Red, highly recommend it. Very, very nice beer.
The more you talk about Canvas, the more I need to try their beers. Sorry, just
Field trip, everyone. Fingers crossed. Field trip.
I think so. I think we'll all be taking that. It's a long way to Tipperary, but not that long. So, Thandi, what are you drinking?
Righto. I have got a beer that I think I've spoken about a couple of times on the podcast, but I'm not sure if I've had it on the podcast. That is the Black Bucket by Kinigar. So it's their Black Rye IPA, and it is absolutely one of my favorites from them. I just love this beer. I just love it so much. It's delicious. It's dark. It's bitter. It's just divine. Love it.
And Lisa, what are you drinking?
So I have Hope's Grunt, which is their citrusy wheat beer. And it's just always nice to support a local brewery. They're only a couple kilometers from my house. But in my head, I have made this incredibly relevant because even though you're like, okay, Vikings wheat beer, come on, where, how, we have no real evidence of them going in for wheat beer. But Dublin Brewery, obviously there were Vikings here in Dublin, and this has a big old kick of juniper in it as well. You see juniper in a lot of what we know about Viking beers. So, I've got the local Viking angle ingredient that we know our Norse friends went for. So it counts, is what I'm saying. It counts. So
Totally.
Thank you guys. Hope.
Good beer counts. It doesn't even have to tie into the episode.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And how about you?
I went for a Smoke and Lasers from Gamma Brewing.
Ooh.
They are Denmark. So I thought
it counts. Yes.
That's Viking adjacent, right?
All
That's
good.
Awesome.
It's not cool. Not a traditional style. It's an IPA, and it's really nice. But so that was my attempt. So before we move on to the topic, I'm just gonna let you all know that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and also on YouTube. And I think we announced, was it last week, that we went past our 100 followers.
So now what's our next goal? Are we going to go for 500 next?
It's up to you, listener.
Go on, subscribe.
Go on. Yeah.
Go on, rope your family and friends in. Let's get this going.
And we are on all the social medias. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Beer Ladies Podcast, and we're on Twitter at Beer Ladies Pod. So please follow us, subscribe, like our posts, and support us and help spread the word of the Beer Ladies, because we just like to chat. You can chat
and like
with us.
Say, even though we're going on holidays, we may drop little bits of fun, little sneaky bits of content here and there. So just if you subscribe, you'll know.
Exactly. So where are we going to start today? We're going to start with women in Viking women and their role in brewing.
Well, I think Lisa and I are going to start with a rant
Oh,
first.
sorry.
We're
Yes.
going to get on a soapbox.
We're
This
good.
is
Yes,
happening.
we're going to get right up on that soapbox. So today's episode is brought to you by Archaeology. So if you know who I am, this is Christina speaking, by the way. I am a historian, but my doctoral thesis is anthropology and archaeology. So I am a historian and archaeologist, and Lisa, of course, is an archaeologist.
Yeah, well, have been an archaeologist once in future, maybe is put it. Yes, my bachelor's and my master's are both in archaeology, and even though I work in tech, highly transferable skills, recommend everyone get a background in archaeology, and we're both super pissed off that they are cutting archaeology programs all across the UK. It's happening now here in Ireland, and it's no bueno. This is not good.
So we're going to shout out right now to IT Sligo. We're going to shout out to Sheffield and Chester universities to their archaeology departments who are unfortunately fighting the fight to keep their programs existing right now. So, archaeology is really important, and this episode could not be possible. And indeed, most of the history episodes that we talk about without archaeology.
Absolutely.
As Lisa said, it's highly transferable skills, but it's valuable in and of itself. And the removal of these departments, or the threats of removal of these departments, is horrific.
Absolutely, yeah, huge impact on how we interpret the past and the future, and as well, sort of taking these programs especially are a real hit for it's really only leaving it at the air quotes, giant air quotes, sort of elite institutions, and that's nonsense. You should be able to come from any background. Go to any university and do an archaeology program, or not even have to go to university. There should just be programs out there in the community, but these are the ones under threat. So we want to shout them out and say, we're thinking of you, we're trying to make it better, and we couldn't do this without you. So
nope.
Why are they going away?
Because reasons, nonsense reasons.
Is it money? It's always money, isn't it?
Money is the alleged, it's always, this doesn't, you're not going to get a big job at a consulting company or whatever. Okay, first of all, you can. Hi, that's me. But also it's this idea of, only STEM is important, and we won't fund the arts. We won't fund the humanities, even though, that's where you get people who can do things. So
yeah, it's part of a bigger program of defunding the arts and not valuing the arts. And the arts are incredibly important. It teaches us how to think and how to process information, and in this day and age that's something that we really, really need, as the events of the last year have clearly shown. The ability to assess sources and source materials, if nothing else. And it's just part of this larger program to defund these things. And so to everyone who's listening, please fight this.
Hear, hear.
Is there something that our listeners and viewers can do? Are there petitions? Are there what can people do?
There are petitions. I have been tweeting them. I will keep tweeting them. I will put them in the show notes. We'll put people to follow actually on Twitter and social media in the show notes who are really fighting against this. So you can weigh in and help them.
Awesome. I'm certainly going to do that. Thank you for
right.
sharing.
Yeah.
Soapbox.
Rant over.
But this is all relevant, and we will get into why. So Christina can set the scene.
Okay, so to dispel sort of the white supremacist idea that the Vikings were sort of like one group with one ethnic identity and these sorts of things. No, the Vikings were incredibly diverse. They spanned from the Irish Sea region all the way up into the Baltic Sea, many, many different places. And of course, the famous Normans descended from the Vikings as well. So we're going to focus specifically on the Vikings who ended up in Ireland. So they primarily came from the west coast of Norway, and we can trace this archaeologically via Scotland and down. And then, of course, the Vikings in Dublin had strong links to York, because the Viking kings of York, were also the Viking kings of Dublin for a time. So we're sort of focusing on that, because otherwise the scope is just way too big. Although we will touch a bit on the Rus a little bit later. And so those are at some point were Vikings from Sweden who ended up in the Baltic Sea region, but we will talk about them later.
Absolutely. They have more homogeneity with their horses than with the people. And that's a whole thing I could go down a rabbit hole on, but I won't. There are people who are the experts in that field. We could shout them out too, but it's a fact.
Absolutely. And just for like sort of like temporal context here. So what time frame am I talking about? We're really starting about 800 to about 1150, though by 1150 and really after just a brief time in the 800s, the Vikings acculturate, they amalgamate with the native Irish, and so a lot of their traditions meld within the Irish community. Now, this is something that's contentious among scholars, so when I am saying this, I am making an argument, so just to be clear. But so, for example, Mary Valente would have argued that by 1014, which is the famous Battle of Clontarf, there were any number of people who could clearly equally be members of Irish and Scandinavian society. And while Irish literati from the medieval period did like to refer to the Vikings as the foreigners, so they were continually referred to as the foreigners, the foreigners, the foreigners. I would argue, and I have argued, and I will continue to argue, that in lived reality, the Vikings certainly adapted and adopted Irish culture. And this is because their cultures were really similar, as we will see. There's also arguments for a mixed or hybrid culture called Hiberno-Norse, although I would say that this is clearly reflected in the material culture. I'm not entirely convinced that this was existent in lived reality. But this is, again, this is all quite contentious. We spend lots of time arguing about this as historians and archaeologists.
Absolutely.
So everyone knows.
But the material culture is where we know about what happened in brewing, or what we sometimes don't know we know about what they were brewing. So there's
also
a lot there.
How does that work, Lisa? What is it? How do we know that?
Well, we'll start out with what people have not noticed, because it's not a problem. It's an opportunity. It's not a problem. So in archaeology, you tend to see patterns you recognize, right? Like everyone who's sort of done archaeology from the 18th century onwards sees kind of their own society in it in some way or another. And I know Christina will get into this very much so, but we will absolutely shout out Maren Dinley, who is an independent scholar, and she has really kind of blown the lid off. Oh my God, they were malting. They were doing all of the stuff around brewing, and all of these sites that were categorized as things like sauna, bathhouse, just things like that was what the mostly white men who excavated these sites understood these things to be from kind of the arrangement. But you actually get into the archaeology, you look at, burnt grains and things you find there. And unless you have a brewing background or know the technical sort of aspects of brewing, you're not going to think, oh, they're brewing here. But if you know, you know. So she's done some amazing work there. We would love to have her on at some point. But I think that's a great example of, the biases you bring into any kind of interpretation. If you don't know what to look for, you don't see it even if it's right there. So I think that's a really, really interesting thing. And we have, I would say, discovered so much more about not just historic, but even sort of prehistoric brewing over probably the last 5 or 10 years than we've known for maybe the last 150. So it's just because people are doing that analysis now, looking at the grains, seeing, oh, there was, there's a germinated grain here, or, many of them, what does this mean? Were they malting, et cetera, et cetera. And I think as we'll get into with, especially with your sort of Viking chieftains, they need like an almost industrial quantity so they can do their feasting. They can do all of their sort of look how fancy I am, which is a big part of the culture. This is not just brewing for the home, although that's happening too, but there's a whole kind of, what's a good phrase? We're doing a big dick measuring contest. That's what's happening here, even though the women are doing all the brewing. So
yeah.
Wait. Okay, so women are doing all the brewing.
Well, no.
Okay.
Some of it. We'll kind of get into that. But before we do that, I want to give another caveat. So we're going to be using Saga examples in our examination today. So these are the literary sources. The Saga materials are completely full of bias, and most of them are written about 300 years after the events they purported to describe. And the people.
But they're great. They're great.
They're really, really interesting. But we have also archaeologically proven some of this stuff actually happened and it existed. So you can't just chuck the sagas out. So you have to kind of really use them with caution. And so I use saga materials on side with archaeology.
Absolutely.
And compare the two to kind of try to reach the reality of what was happening in the Vikings.
Katie has a question.
I have a question. So for the non-archaeology people in the room,
The norm.
Me. What is Saga material?
So the Saga materials are possibly oral traditions that were spoken over and over and over, and then finally written down, as I said, after the Viking Age famously by Snorri Sturluson, but by other people. So,
this was history that they reckon was passed down, but written in when was it written? Like in
300
the 17th?
years. No. Still the medieval period.
Oh, okay.
Period. Just after the Viking Age.
Yeah, and some are more literary than others. We'll put it that way. Some are very poetical. Some are more historical, but not in a sense we would consider historical. It's a very different understanding.
Yeah, and so also big important thing is a lot of these are Christian writing about a pagan past. So there's a lot of bias there and a lot of perhaps misinterpretation of rituals and what things meant, which I mean, I have I get so angry about just certain interpretations. But yeah, so there's a lot of bias in these things. But we can look at that and we can compare it to archaeology and we can make some meaningful conclusions, because reality is when you're looking at this far back, you're reaching meaningful conclusions based on the data. Anyone who's probably telling you that this definitely happened absolutely 100% of the time, it's just no.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a thing. So I guess we can probably kick it off with talking about women and ale and women in serving ale and sort of the importance of that. So Michael Einright actually wrote the book, The Lady with the Mead Cup. And I highly recommend that if you are interested in the relationship between women and serving ale and sort of this early medieval war band that we're going to talk about now. And so an important part of this society, Viking society, but indeed Irish society as well, this is part of those parallel cultures that we were talking about, is women serving. So that is the process of handing your husband, your father, the Lord, ale. And part of this is handing the person the ale and then reiterating their status. So Einright has postulated that this was actually sort of a ritual, a way of formal address. And we can see this in the Irish source materials, and we can see this, of course, in the Viking materials. So for example, and then this will be my own translation. So there is this poem concerning none other than Attila the Hun. And part of this poem, his wife comes out to greet him. And the poem says, out came Guthrun to meet Atli with golden cups or goblets to offer tribute to the gods. And then after this, she addresses her husband. She names Atli as the chief, and she invites him into the feast. However, in sort of a twist of this ritual, she mimics the style of address and she mocks and debases him because he had just murdered her brothers. And so in return, she murdered his sons and fed them to him.
As you do.
Sorry. That's so grim. I love it.
Oh, this is the saga. Seriously, honestly, I highly recommend reading the sagas because this kind of stuff is par for the course.
Yeah.
And was Attila a Viking?
No.
Attila the Hun? No. Okay.
No. So she had been married to him.
He had a lot of wives, though. Lots and lots of wives. So,
but yeah, so basically what she does is she hands this to him. She calls him the giver of swords. And then she's basically like, yeah, so that meat that you've been eating, that's your kids. Yeah.
And again, obviously, we have parallels for this in many, many, many other myths and traditions. Well, 100%.
Yeah, this
is revenge. Oh, the Penguin does that in Gotham, doesn't he?
Well, yeah, and I mean, she doesn't stop there. She slaughters. He gets very drunk, and the rest of the hall gets very drunk, and so she slaughters him in his bed. She frees all his slaves. She frees all his dogs. She then lights the hall on fire and burns everyone inside.
Again, as you do.
Okay.
It escalated quickly, but over time.
You sure we're not like on Game of Thrones here?
No, well, see, Game of Thrones has nothing on the sagas. Like, honestly, they have nothing on the sagas. The sagas are way more intense. But this introduces a couple of really important things that we're going to talk about today, which is the role of women in serving ale. And as I said, this is part of the the rituals of power. So when a woman gives, and this is arguments by Einrich, and I would agree with him based on like my own research, and for my book, I'm writing a book. So if people aren't familiar, I'm writing a book called Filthy Queens: The History of Beer in Ireland, and the material that we're talking about today makes up chapter 2 of my book. So as I was saying, this ritual of serving the Lord first. So when you do that, you're solidifying his power, announcing his stature. And so people that drink after him, as Einrich has contended, have accepted his domination and his position. And so basically it's a way to form a war band and to accept rule or dominance from the highest ranking person. And this was, of course, really important within this context.
So that's what I wanted to ask. Sorry, Katie. Was it then prestigious for a woman to be able to do this?
Yes.
Or was it okay?
So it was an incredibly prestigious position. This was something that was by the wife or the daughter, very high ranking, to the point where like we find the accoutrements of drinking and serving materials in women's burials. This was a really important part of hegemonic, feminine, semiotics, high status. We're talking like the elite of the elite. This was the top of the table. And this was a ritual that would have been understood cross-culturally. So it's something we see in Irish, we see in Viking, through the continent, Franks. This is as Einrich called the lady with the mead cup. It's just so prevalent, and we see it in art, in Viking art, the Valkyries or the woman handing the cup to the man, sometimes with a bucket, sometimes with a ladle. So this is just a really, really important part of this society.
And would this have been so you're saying it's like it's showing power and chieftains, but would normal families have done this? Would the mammy in the family have offered it to the husband, or
well the ritual that we're talking about is a ritual. So this is going to be a high status power ritual within the public sphere of feasting. So this is when we're going to talk about funeral feasts or freedom feasts and these kind of things. So this was at like a highly ritualized feast. So this is a public act. Okay. This is a performance.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is part and parcel, of course, also associated with Sather, which is the Viking practice of magic, which was also highly associated with women. So with Sather, we have magic, and this is associated with brewing and serving ale. And we also have weaving. So these three things kind of really work together. And we can see that throughout burial practice, the items of serving ale associated with textiles or textile work in burial. And then this, of course, is really repeated throughout the saga materials. So, we know the Valkyries are serving ale, but they're also weaving, and sometimes they're weaving men's entrails together to foretell who is going to win, or they're choosing the slain in a battle. So this idea of weaving and weaving lives and weaving threads together is very associated with magic, and of course with forms of femininities.
Yeah, but I think, Katie, to your question, of course, your average sort of Viking housewife, as it were, is also just, her day to day. She's doing a lot of weaving just while she's standing around. She's making wool, or she's turning that wool, into yarn. She's spinning. She's just kind of hanging out doing that while she's doing other things. If you go to Dublinia, and I think again, fun field trip for everyone, they talk to you about what that's like, how that was just something people did kind of without even thinking of it as just an everyday activity, but then it gets up-leveled into this, again, kind of, magic ritual spectrum. And
so weaving was the scrolling through Twitter of its day.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Okay.
Well, it's also like, even in the mundane or not elite context, weaving is definitely still associated with magic. Viking people's systems of belief, because we're not talking about an organized religion or one way of doing things. People within that context, people's lives were ritualized in a way that we cannot even begin to fathom. So even weaving at a common level, or like at a lower levels in the social hierarchy, is still absolutely associated and strongly associated with magic practice.
With
Exactly.
magic practice. Oh,
I think every woman can do some bit of magic. So I think that's an interesting, again, we don't have this kind of, framework. So it's just a very different view.
Yeah, and I mean there were definitely professional Sather practitioners. We have, for example, like the Vuelva or wand carrier. And we actually have an example of the Vuelva staff within a burial group in Ireland. And we know because of Norwegian law codes that these staffs were used with magic. So we have a law code from the 12th century that says no person shall have in their house staff or altar, charms or sacrificial offering, or nothing that is concerning heathen religion. And these staffs are mentioned over and over again in the sagas. I'm not going to get into all my translations because that's not what we're talking about today. But we do know that these staffs and the magic practice was definitely happening in Ireland.
And you're saying that they were saying you couldn't have these staffs and it was outlawed and things, but back before it was outlawed, was it very common to be doing all this magic?
Well, this was the practice, of course.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's high status women. So Einrad has argued, and I have argued as well, that it's clearly a high status female position. And so they're serving ale, but they also are taking part of this magic. So they're definitely still practicing magic. We even have Irish sources talking about Viking women practicing magic, possibly on altars and things of that nature. So this was not somewhat limited practice like this. Like I said, there were professional practitioners, but this was part of their systems of beliefs. And like Neil Price, I think, put it sort of the best. He said, and I'm probably going to mess up this quote, but he said, for the Vikings, believing in the gods was like believing in the sea. Like it just was.
Okay.
Well, and it seems like
So
you
it
could
wasn't
make
a belief so much. It was just it just was. It was like a fact of life.
Yeah, because their gods aren't their gods aren't like the Christian God. So their gods very happily would trip you in war, or cause you to die at the end because that was the mood that they were in. Like they weren't necessarily these bastions of, I guess, with the Christianity idea of you pray to God and he does amazing things. Some of the Norwegian gods, the Norse gods, the Viking gods, they got up to some stuff.
Do we think that is there a direct sort of correlation, I wonder, between these magic staffs that then get sort of outlawed and the magic sticks you're using to stir your beer that has basically, that we know has your yeast on it? Or do we think that they're completely separate, or do they have a parallel, I wonder?
I wonder if there's a parallel, but I haven't seen in the literary sources and I haven't seen in the archaeology. And a lot of these staffs, so a lot of them will have like a basket weave at the top, and they're huge. Like some of them are like really big. Some of them are smaller. The Kilmainham staff you can actually see in the National Museum of Ireland Archaeology. Some people say that is a roasting spit. It is not a roasting spit, and I will die on this hill. But yeah, so they're very, very valuable. But when we see them in the saga materials, they're not using them to brew. They're
Yeah. Okay. So they are different, but I wonder too if you see the fancy ones, and maybe your common and garden one is kind of what you're using, but again, they could be completely different things too. Yeah.
Or they could be a bit of both. Like it could be, we need a stick. Let's have a magic practice. Let's magically imbue this, because I'm sure. I mean, if we're saying that brewing and weaving and magic practice were these domains of women in certain contexts, right? In these certain situations, and I'm sure that there was part and parcel of the brewing process that was somewhat magical, right? So yeah, possibly. Yeah. I mean, anything's a possibility.
More research is needed.
Definitely, more research is needed.
More archaeology departments are needed. Okay,
and you have
we're
to
getting
go back
the message.
Exactly, and you have to go back and look at things you dug up 200 years ago or 150 years ago and be like, wait, did no one ever look at this? And then
re-examine everything.
Well, and that's part of the problem because for example, in Ireland, a lot of this archaeological material was dug up in the Victorian period or the 19th century, and they lost stuff. They didn't bring a lot of stuff back.
They melted down gold all over the place, and you can understand why. People were very poor, and
they did what they needed to do. But for us, it makes things difficult to put back together. That said, we do have archaeological examples of possibly, bowls that were used, a bowl, the Ballyholme bowl that was used for serving in conjunction with this sort of textile and weaving, because there are textiles and textile stuff found with the bowl, sort of reiterating this idea possibly of serving and weaving, with this link of like serving ale and alcohol. And ale, most importantly, for our purposes. Ale.
So I know that, Lisa, you were saying juniper was in the Hope beer. So what type of beer? And Christina is talking about ale. So what were they brewing?
Those that we know about, are pretty interesting. And then again, people do some really amazing historic recreations. They do tend to go this sort of, if you like, gruit route, because obviously they would not have had hops.
So
they do tend to be barley. Yeah, so no hops, but it could be bittered with, sort of sweet gale, all kinds of different things, heather even, although probably more in Scotland. But, the bittering, the preservatives are not coming from hops just because they're not a thing yet, at least in this context. That said, they may be here as well in some places. So there's, again, more research is needed because some of what we do have is a little bit of a mishmash. So, but again, you do find juniper. You find juniper in all kinds of contexts, sort of across Scandinavia, as well as here in Ireland and in Iceland as well. And so it's interesting that you find it. But then you go to Finland, which is again sort of culturally separate but related, where they're making sahti. That traditionally, even now, still has juniper in it, where they're throwing the hot rocks in the water. And I know, Christina, you just saw some super cool stuff about that. But I think that tends to have juniper, and it does seem like there is a historic through line we can trace back of just traditionally it has juniper because it's got that a little bit of bittering, it's got that sort of very gin-like obviously taste to it, and it does add a little something.
Yeah, and from a malt perspective, we have done archaeological studies, of course, of Viking Dublin, particularly like a fish amble street, for example. And we found barley in most abundance, followed by oats and wheat. And we know from the Irish source material that they were using barley, oats, wheat, and sometimes rye, possibly, depending on the status of the person who the ale was being made. But importantly, hot rocks. So we're going to talk about hot rocks.
Okay, let's do it.
Get your rocks off. Go on.
And they do sometimes explode, so...
Yes, and that's kind of how we know they were probably used because we found exploded cracked stones on historic farms. And I will add that to the source materials for this episode because there's a really good article about an archaeological analysis of the layers in the farms, and they found remains of these cracked stones, what could be used for brewing purposes. And this was probably likely widespread. And that's why I mentioned this Malman, this smoke red ale, which was a red ale with birch smoked malt and Kvike, never pronounce it right, yeast. So this is a single source beer with all the ingredients and energy resourced from the farm. And the reason I mentioned this was because it was part of that Lithuanian beer talk that I went to, where they still brew using farmhouse techniques in Lithuania today. And part of those farmhouse techniques is brewing with hot rocks. Now, again, Lithuania, not Viking, but it does, tell us that this brewing process is possible. And they have done the Moore Group, an archaeological group, archaeology group in Ireland, have conducted a hot rock brewing experiment based on the Fulach Fia, which is an Irish method, but using
could we just have a quick definition of what it means to brew with hot rocks or hot stones, and what does it do, what does it add, how does it work?
Right. So you don't have to boil an ale, right? if you're not necessarily adding hops. So with hot rock brewing, you can add these hot rocks. You heat the rocks up in fire or kiln or whatever you're using, oven, and you add them to, you can use wood. So you don't necessarily have to have the expensive copper alloy or whatever cauldrons. You can use a wooden bucket or wooden materials to heat up the malt. To get the wort, because you don't need to boil it. So you don't need to use all that energy that you might not have because you don't have that money to make wort.
And
So
you may
it's
not
not
have that
done
wood.
over a. It's not done over a fire. It's heated like the old Victorian hot water pan things, or a stone for a bit. Okay, wow.
Yeah, so that's I'm sure that, you know, different places had different ways of doing it, but that's, you know, a way to use hot rocks was to heat them separately and introduce them into a wooden bucket or something of that nature.
Yeah, and you have to think too, the Vikings, when they turn up both in Ireland and in Iceland, they pretty quickly chop down all the trees, so wood becomes very, very, very expensive, and it's a parallel in both places, and you know, severe climate change in both places because of that. But there you go.
Yeah, you're not going to use the fuel if you don't have to, right? Bringing something to boil uses a lot of fuel, a lot of wood. If you don't have to do that, you're not going to do it. You don't have the time, the money to waste.
That is really, really interesting. And so there is evidence of that happening in Ireland, but it has continued, or the tradition has continued in Lithuania, so we know exactly how it was done. And
but we don't have like the cracked rocks here.
Okay.
Or they may not have been noticed, which is also another possibility.
It's probably more of that. But
so
yeah.
Was that a Viking practice that we haven't necessarily seen here, but because there's parallels, we think it could be here? Like, how does it play?
Yeah, so basically we have evidence for it in Viking context, and because the Vikings were here, and we do know that they carried on a lot of what they were doing from whence they came, it is likely that similar processes took place. That combined with the idea that we might have been using hot rocks in a Phylloxera method, which existed, of course, pre-medieval, but might have continued on because a lot of the Iron Age things and rituals and things that were happening in early Ireland, many scholars would argue are continuing into the early medieval period.
Yeah, and we see this in Denmark and Norway as well. Absolutely.
So it is possible that there was a continuation. But like I said, we're talking about early medieval stuff. So a lot of this is speculation, but that's all we can do.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It's just so interesting. And there's an active, or there's not an active, Phylloxera in Cragonone and Clare. If we do a road trip down there, maybe, that you can go to see, right, in the Cranog.
Explain how that works.
That was how they used to cook their meat. I did a school tour here when I was a kid. So they would heat all of the rocks. They had a hole in the ground, basically. And they would heat all of these rocks up so they were red hot. They would put the meat, wrap the meat in, I'm not really sure what they wrapped it in, some type of cloth or skin or something. And then they would like put the rocks on the bottom, put the meat in, put the rocks all around it, and then cover it in clay and leave it for like a day or two or even longer. And that was how they cooked their meat.
It's like a modern day slow cooker.
Yeah.
Huh.
Okay.
Guys.
And I think that actually brings an interesting point that we should talk about, Lisa, before we run out of time, which is feasting, because I think that's really important, and the role of ale and feast, before I get ahead of myself and start going off on tangents about other things. So we're gonna start with funeral feasts, and we'll kind of go from there. We have lots of evidence, both archaeologically and in literary sources, for funeral feasts, including the Tombstone. So the stone was actually made prior to the Viking era. It was found in the parish of Thun by a man called Dr. Peter Alfonsson. And it was this large runic stone. So there are two sides, but the one side that we will be concerned about is side B. There are several competing interpretations, but I'm going to go with the following, which is for Woodundar, a stone, 3 daughters prepared, a funeral feast, the noblest of heirs. And this might be the the oldest account of female inheritance in sort of the Scandinavian world. It is the oldest legal source for female inheritance in the Scandinavian world. And so, okay, great. There's a funeral feast. What does it have to do with ale? Well, good question. So for the funeral feast, they would brew something called ætteøl, so funeral ale or inheritance ale. And so this was a really important part of sort of passing the torch on possibly to the next person. So we can kind of see where what role this would play from the Saga source, the Farskinna. And I'm going to read you a little bit from that. So, and he who arranged the funeral feast was not to sit in that man's seat whom he inherited until the men had drunk the funeral ale. And in the last place, there should be filled a bragaful. And bragaful is a cup. And then he who held the funeral feast had to make a promise at the bragaful. And so all who participated in the funeral feast, and then the heir would enter into the seat of the man who had left the inheritance, and then the inheritance was fulfilled and the praise accomplished after the dead man, but not before that. So essentially, the heir or heirs of the deceased were to commission this funeral ale, and it was not until that they had made their promises over this ale in this bragaful, which is a very high status and important cup, king's cup, lord's cup, that kind of thing. And they made their oaths over this cup that they could officially claim their inheritance. This was a really important part. And the bragaful is the name of the cup, but it's also this concept of toasting, which was linked with this idea of mini, which is remembering. So literally memory.
That's so cool.
This idea of death and funeral and ale is really, really important. And this idea of ale and the use of ale in these rituals is not just in funeral ale. We also see it in freedom ale. So the Vikings kept slaves, as did most people, many cultures in the early medieval period. Ireland did. Early medieval English kept slaves as well. And so the practice of freedom ale, which the details of this ritual we can see from the Gulathing Slav, which is a series of medieval Norwegian law tracts, has a similar entry, which is if a thrall, now a thrall is a slave, takes up land or sets up a home, he shall give his freedom ale, serving the brew of 9 measures of malt. Now, if the owner seems willing to let him give his freedom ale, he shall ask him before 2 witnesses whether he may give his ale, and he shall invite him with 5 others to the feast that he plans to give his freedom ale. So in order to be freed, the thrall or the person who has been enslaved must serve his slaver this freedom ale. And this is this freedom ale feast. And so this was the ritual with which they gained freedom.
It seems really, really well documented. It's like there will be 2 witnesses and no less than 5 people will come to the house. And
so I have a question. Do we know anything about these different kinds of ales? Like, was a funeral ale different to a freedom ale? Like in its composition, in its flavor, its taste, its significance, its multiple, whatever?
I can't tell you specifics about that, but I do know, well, if we look at Irish sources, we can tell you that there's a lot of different kinds of ale, and I would be assuming that we would have a similar situation in Viking society. There would be no reason why there wouldn't be, especially considering there's a lot of, scandal around whether they used hops, when they used hops, who used hops, what sort of bittering agents they might have used. Did they use bittering agents? We also know different kinds of ales were possibly made. And I'm not saying ale itself, but there were ales that might have been mixed with honey, forming sort of a braggot. This is all really contentious because when honey was added, how much honey was added, was it actually honey? There's also arguments to be made that this was actually a fruit-based beverage, a fruit and barley-based beverage, was there something completely different? There's a lot of contention amongst scholars at exactly what this looks like, what these are. Things that have been interpreted as ale in the past have had scholars coming along and say, well, actually, we think this might be a different beverage, or actually, we think this might be ale, but also this mixed together to make something new. So there are different things happening.
Yeah, and
Cocktails.
archaeologically, we tend to find barley, but we tend to find barley because we've been looking for it more than we've looked for other things. Like we've not necessarily gone back to look at, well, what were people finding in, excavations in the 1890s? They didn't even look at things like grains, or, if they're still there, people haven't looked at it. And so but we also do know, again, to compare to Iceland, it got harder and harder to grow barley there. So only your, big man people could do it. But the feasting would also involve a lot of sort of, again, high status, conspicuous consumption, which you get everywhere. But they were all about slaughtering cattle with their, with their ale. I don't know to what extent you get that as much in Ireland, because I think, obviously cattle, are a huge thing in this period. But I think because they were more scarce in Iceland, it becomes a different sort of resource, if you like. So sort of similar people, but having a sort of very different sort of scarcity, if you like.
And Irish sources, so we have the Book of Rights, which talks about a lot of these entitlements of kings from like higher kings. So in this period, there's the concept of gift exchange, and similar to the serving and accepting that the person was served before you as their dominance, it's a similar thing with gift exchange. So the higher ranking king would give gifts to his subordinates. Their acceptance was accepting his dominance, and in exchange, they would owe tribute. And part of this gift exchange is ale. And there are, things that say, 12 vats of every kind of ale. So, and
what does that mean? Yeah.
Yeah. And in this same Book of Rights, the foreigners, which are the Vikings, are mentioned. So we can have an idea that the Vikings would have been around this concept of ale. And actually, if I can find my section, I can't find it. But they're within that relationship, or within that text, and they're talking about the Vikings in Ireland. They do talk about fostering with the Vikings and passing around the drinking horns. So we do know that the Vikings are fostering with that. We know this from a lot of sources, but we can also see this directly in relation to drinking ritual within Ireland.
So besides funerals, freedom, what other big rituals were there that we might see?
Yule!
Specific ales.
Yule.
Yule.
We
Okay,
talked a
awesome.
little bit about Yule before, so we can put a link in the show notes. But Yule, like, it was so important. It ends up in the legal codes, hundreds of years later, because if you screw this up, you are in big trouble. It is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, you can get completely banished from the country if you don't show up with your ale like that you're supposed to have after, I think, 3 years.
Something like that. Yeah, your first time you kind of get a pass, but then they're like, TikTok.
Yeah, but where do you go? We're on an island.
Oh, people get banished all the time in the Viking period, and then
Seriously?
Oh yeah, they go from island to island. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're off. But do keep in mind when we're talking about a lot of these legal codes, in particular the Irish ones, that a lot of these are prescriptive, which means that's what they wanted things to be, not necessarily how they were.
Yeah.
So this is what I hope things are, but not necessarily what they actually look like. A lot of this stuff could be interpreted differently depending on, who is there and what's actually happening. So do keep that in mind when we're talking about legal codes.
Yeah, but I think there's absolutely something there about seasonality, and it's different in different times of year. And again, you have ritual with a capital R, and you have ritual with a small r, and they are, they're simpatico, but they can be different. So
yeah, and I guess the final sort of ritual big thing that we can talk about, and here's the ruse, is human sacrifice.
Okay, let's just end off on a bang. Right.
Well, I'm going to tell you that it didn't happen. So,
oh, good.
So the ruse, well, this is around. So that I'm going to tell you. So
okay,
their group
cool.
is a group who were originally Scandinavians, who were living in the Baltic regions in Northern Europe, and particularly active in the Volga region around the Caspian Sea. So this is way removed from our Norwegian Vikings in Ireland. But this account that I'm going to read to you now is the one that everyone talks about when they say they want a Viking funeral. This is where it comes from. So we have Ibn Fadlan. So he was writing around 921 to 922. So he recorded a death of a great man of the Rus. And what he argued was an example of voluntary human sacrifice. So after the man died, an enslaved girl purportedly volunteers to accompany him in death. She drinks and feasts for several days while his body and his burial boat are prepared. How much agency she had, I don't really think she had any, because she's of course enslaved. But here we're going to talk about the use of ale and alcohol to grant the girl reprieve. And this idea, again, with magic practice, of achieving this altered state of consciousness necessary for the ritual. So she's achieving this status by drinking. So on the day of the ceremony, the girl was killed by the so-called angel in death, who Ibn Fadlan refers to as a witch, thick-bodied and sinister. And this is after several days of rituals, and content warning here, trigger warning, including gang rape, and culminating into this brutal end for the girl, who was stabbed and strangled to death. After placing her body on the boat with the other sacrifices, the closest male relative to the deceased walks backwards to the boat with a torch covering his anus to light the boat on fire,
As you do,
and complete the funerary rituals. So this is where
I love how oddly specific this is.
This is where your idea of the famous Viking funeral comes from. In this story, Ibn Fadlan refers to the Rus. They were drinking what they were drinking as nabith, which is a drink from his own culture, made from raisins or grapes, steeped in water, and is generally non-intoxicating, with negligible amounts of alcohol, unless it's left to steep for a long period of time. However, here he's saying they drink it day and night, so sometimes one of them dies with his wine cup in his hand. So we can tell us that this was not non-alcoholic and probably quite intoxicating. He stated, quote, if he was wealthy, they gathered together his fortune and divided into 3 parts, one for his family, one for the clothes cut out for him, and another to have the nabith served that they will drink on the day that his slave girl kills herself and is burned with her master. So we can have this idea here. And this is probably not a non-alcoholic beverage. And given the role of funeral ale, it is probably something very similar. And so, as we said, the enslaved girl spends days prior to her murder drinking and singing, which tells us that this consumption of ale was a really important part of the funeral. And in the death ritual, they handed the girl a cup of the nabith. And this is a quote. They handed a girl a cup of nabith. She sang a song over it and drank. The interpreter translated what she was saying and explained that she was bidding all her female companions farewell. They gave her another cup. She took it and continued singing for a long time, while the old woman encouraged her to drink and then urged her to enter the pavilion and join her master. So this does remind us of ale use in other Viking sources and other sources that is probably applicable to what we're doing. So we can see ale here deployed as a way to gain an altered state of consciousness that was necessary for these rituals inherent in Viking society. However, I do not think that this was applicable to Vikings in Ireland. And I don't necessarily think that it was applicable to Vikings in general. So the group of people that Ibn Fadlan was talking about are known as the Rus, and modern scholars, as I said, often base their arguments on the practice of Viking burial by using these Arabic writers about these Rus people. Again, just like the sagas, they are full of bias because we are talking about people of a different religion writing about a different kind of people. Also, Ibn Fadlan is using a translator, so he might not understand exactly what's happening. More to the point, these people are a few generations removed from their original Viking heritage, and so they might now be displaying traditions that are more reflective of the local Slavic culture and traditions, and not their original Scandinavian practices.
Yeah, and also, I would add. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, and I was just going to say the majority of these even original Vikings were of Swedish descent, which of course is not Norwegian, which is where our Western Norwegians and subsequently our Irish Vikings, majority of which come from.
Absolutely. And just to add on it too, most people know this, know I'm putting in air quotes, not from the primary sources, which like Christina said, are already, sort of removed from what may or may not have been happening. Most people actually know this from the Michael Crichton novel, Eaters of the Dead, which takes that as a sort of a starting point, and then it gets super weird beyond that. Like, worth a read, really good. And shout out to Wide Atlantic Weird podcast, another Irish podcast. They actually talked about it in a recent episode. Fascinating stuff. It was also made into a film called The 13th Warrior with Antonio Banderas. It's a weird film, but obviously you're dealing with very peculiar source material, but it is where we get a lot of this kind of Viking as zombie, if you like, thing. It really, like, it's extra. I'll put it that way. But again, there is a source material that we can go back and look at and say, what does this mean? But then it goes off in directions, and people tend to know the bits and pieces from those directions it goes off into, which is all cool and fun from a sort of literary or sort of film perspective. But it's weird, and again, the sagas are already weird. This is a modern interpretation of something that wasn't even a saga, so it's weird. It can be fun weird, but it's weird.
Yeah, so exactly. And like to summarize, I would say that this is not applicable. If this happened, which I'm very dubious about, but if this happened, it's definitely not applicable to what is happening in Ireland. And it's not really going to be applicable to the Vikings in general. It is probably more reflective of a local tradition and things that are happening there, because the archaeological material supporting human sacrifice is really scant. There was a 2013 archaeological study on isotope and ancient DNA analysis on people that they thought might have been sacrificed. They hypothesized that there were extra people in certain individuals in certain double or triple burials. And they hypothesized that these might have been enslaved people sacrificed to their enslavers as they were missing crania. Part of their... The osteological analysis, however, showed no signs of decapitation, but the authors argue that, quote, lack of evidence cannot serve as a strong argument, but argumenta excellentio, which doesn't mean that they were either. So to me, they found 4 headless bodies that showed no conclusive signs of decapitation, and 2 double graves and 1 triple grave. These multiple burials might not have been such, but instead positioning of the bodies might have been caused by agricultural disturbance. So they might not actually have even been buried together.
Okay.
I think it's a massive reach. And I don't agree with it. And then the other examples of possible inhumations with possible sacrifices are really colored, I think, by Victorian ideology of widows killing themselves after their husbands have died. Now, there are saga examples of possible human sacrifices. We have them in the Heimskringla Saga and the Saga of St. Olaf. But I don't believe, I really am not sure that these are reliable sources of information to support the claims when we position this in comparison with the archaeological materials. I remain unconvinced that human sacrifice was a widespread practice, or if even was practiced much at all, if at all.
Well, that's a relief. But okay, so I've got 2 questions. The one is probably a really stupid question, but do these sagas, is that the origin of the word saga? Because this sounds like soap operas for freaking Viking times.
They were soap operas. Oh my goodness. Like I really highly recommend reading them because they are absolute soap operas. And actually really, really interesting for roles of women. If you're interested in the history of women, I highly recommend reading the sagas. There's a really interesting trope called the Inciting Woman. So this actually has to do with our concept of ale and drinking ale and women and power and magic, because women in Norse society and the Norse saga material, as well as in Ireland, incite their husbands, incite their brothers, incite their fathers to war, to stand up for themselves, to stand up for their family, their position, their hierarchy, where they are in the pecking order. This was a really important role for women. And so you have a lot of women within these sagas going, "You're a coward. What are you doing? Fight him. Go fight him. Fight him. Fight him."
Oh, word.
And just absolutely insulting left, right, and it's
and some of them have great names like the Deep-Minded, and they are amazing. And obviously, like, a lot of them are real people, or were real people, or based on real people. So it's cool stuff.
But we do know, like, a lot of it is sort of not necessarily accurate either, because for example, we have Njal Saga, and there's a section in there about the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, which is this massive battle here in Ireland, very famous, very, very misunderstood. And in this section, it talks about Brian Boru's ex-wife Gormla, and how she was so beautiful that she was promising herself to all of these Norwegian lords in order to get them to agree and to. But I mean, of course, at this point in time, Gormla is probably in her 60s. Which, nothing wrong with that, but they portray her as this like young, bitter divorcee, sort of Helen of Troy figure, and she's probably in her 60s, maybe not quite Helen of Troy.
This is before the time of modern medicine and good nutrition, so
yeah.
No Botox.
I think that might be a whole episode in itself.
Oh, we could do a Battle of Clontarf, absolutely.
Oh, listen, I wrote my master's dissertation on Gormla. I have a lot of things to say about how people have completely misrepresented her and completely misunderstood her character, her literary portrayals, actually.
So I've got one more question, and I know that this is maybe a little bit further reaching, and I know that Vikings were not one kind of people in one kind of part of the world, but there are often a lot of myths, I guess, or a lot of stereotypes about Viking people. So for one, them being ferocious warriors, another one, the women fighting along with the men in various battles. Like how much of what we think of Vikings in general is actually true? And I say true loosely.
It's a few things. So the idea that the Vikings were really ferocious, in an Irish context, it's that they had superior weapons technology, and that they didn't know the rules of Irish fighting, and they didn't follow the rules of Irish fighting. So a lot of scholars have postulated that early medieval Ireland was underpopulated. So killing a lot of people wasn't the end game. And so the Vikings came in and they didn't follow those rules, and they had, again, superior weapon technology. So they could do more damage, and they did. But, the Irish were sacking monasteries, and monasteries were going to war with each other. This was not like a uniquely Viking thing. The idea that there were women who were fighting, I mean, there's always women who've been fighting, right? In every culture, women fight. We know this. But I have a problem as an archaeologist with people who gender burials based on grave goods and osteological sexing. I think that I know that gender is a social construct, and it is constructed differently in different time periods by different people. I also know that burial is a ritual practice that was created and made for the living. And so a lot of times burials are representative of the story that the living want to tell, and might not necessarily have anything to do with the person interred. So I really caution anyone to say that because of X, Y, and Z in a burial, this means that this was this gender and this thing was happening, because it could very well be that the state was threatened, the people were threatened, the family was threatened, and they decided to have a more elaborate burial practice. Because from an anthropological standpoint, humans do this. We do it now. We did it in the Victorian era. When the people in power or the state is threatened, they engage in more elaborate funerary displays. It is what we do. So these things don't necessarily mean that it was a woman warrior. there are lots of other options. It could be that the people who buried the person wanted this kind of display. It could be that the person buried was a trans man, because we do know that the Vikings acknowledged multiple genders and the possibility of a binary that was strong and weak, not male and female. There's all these different possibilities, and I don't want to erase anyone's identity by presuming their gender based on grave goods. I just don't think that it helps. I don't think it's useful.
Yeah, it's more complex than that. And again, like, you know, having a sword and let's say maybe an armor, that may be like Christina is saying, a representation of power. It may not be a gendered thing at all. It's you know, we just don't know enough. And again, there are these multiple genders in Viking society that have kind of been swept under the rug for a long time, but they're there in the literature and they're there archaeologically.
It seems like the ultimate irony, because what I've been noticing a lot on like, guys, don't laugh at me too hard, but I'm often on Instagram Reels and I'm just like scrolling endlessly because I'm trying desperately not to download TikTok. But anyway, same thing. But I'm seeing a lot of stuff of people who are maybe acting, maybe living, maybe pretending to, maybe dressing up as Vikings, in air quotes now. And what's interesting to me is that it seems to almost be very patriarchal, very traditional, very woman serves beer, man has beard. You know, it's like it seems it seems as if it's a little bit of a conservative part of society wanting to go back, and again in air quotes, to something more traditional. But what you're saying to me now is that there's nothing traditional about what we know as Viking culture. But these are people that would say, oh, they're modern Vikings. And that's so weird to me.
Well, I wouldn't go too far, because these are patriarchal societies. I mean, all of these societies are patriarchal in nature. It's just that they might have manifested that a bit differently, because like everything, gender is a social construct, patriarchy is a social construct, and it's constructed in different ways in different societies. And Viking society was quite patriarchal, but that doesn't mean there weren't loopholes or other ways of interpreting gender that was still within the patriarchal norm. So if we're talking about a weak, strong binary, that doesn't mean that women who were on the strong side of that binary were viewed necessarily as women. So there is actually this idea, particularly of women who sort of gain this sort of idea of maidenhood, and they become maiden warriors. And so their gender is not the same gender as another woman who perhaps engages in more hegemonic or stereotypically feminine things within this system of patriarchy. So this is a different kind of womanhood. This is a different gender. This is a different expression, or perhaps, like I said, perhaps different gender. So, but it's still within the confines of the patriarchy, because they have removed themselves from that passive role in a sexual relationship. They don't have that role anymore. So because they're not performing the passive role in a sexual relationship with a man, they're not passive. So they're on this strong side of this binary, because there's a lot to do with being the active versus passive participant in a sexual relationship that has to do with this weak, strong binary. And that's a whole tangent for another day.
Oh my goodness, that sounds like it.
We can bring this back to beer. We can do it.
Yeah, I promise. Please read Carol Clover if you're interested in more of that, because she is the expert in that. But it is really, really interesting. But basically, it is still a patriarchy, and But I do agree with you, because Viking studies, well, medieval history in general, but Viking studies has a white supremacy problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can only get better by acknowledging it and, you know, trying to work its way out of it. So it's, it's problematic. And again, the more people learn about these things, the more we can sort of fight against them. So don't cancel your archaeology department. You need it to be able to go out and say, no, this was not a thing. So
yeah.
And I suppose, are we ready to leave it there? Is that the note we want to leave it on? Don't cancel your archaeology department?
Please don't cancel your archaeology department.
Don't cancel your archaeology department. But also, there's some great beer out there. There are some great historic recreations out there that people are trying, again, not through that white supremacist lens, but people who are looking at the actual evidence out there saying, ooh, let's try brewing this. Oh, this is not going to be to modern taste. Let's tweak it a little. So there are some really, really cool things out there, certainly in the home brewing world, but commercially as well, especially, I think, both here and in the UK, as well as in Scandinavia. Like, let's, big up the brewers who are, trying their best to make it, take something from history and make it sort of, relevant to the modern palate.
Absolutely.
And do we know who those brewers are?
There are a bunch out there. Beer Nouveau in the UK has done a couple of things. And certainly if you go to anywhere in Scandinavia, you go all over Denmark, people are trying different things. Sometimes you get the odd Mikkeller one, but some of your smaller ones tend to give it a shot. And I know, Christina, you did that awesome thing with the folks from Lithuania, like you were saying. There's some cool stuff out there in sort of what I'll call sort of northern farmhouse brewing.
Also, I'm developing several medieval beer recipes for the Irish the Irish world. So shout out to any commercial breweries who want to get on board with me, or home brewers as well. We can have a chat about what we're doing, but do let me know, because I'm in the process, have made a couple of different recipes using the medieval source material.
And that might be something we talk about when we come back after our break later this summer.
Yeah, because this is our season finale, and I think we're going to leave it there for the summer.
Yeah.
But again, keep an eye on all of our socials. You may see us pop up. Just
yeah. So our socials are on Twitter. We're at Beer Ladies Pod. We're on Facebook and Instagram. We're Beer Ladies Podcast, and we're also on YouTube. But we are wherever you get your podcasts. Keep following us. We might have sneaky little clips to tease you until we come back in August. Does anyone have any final words, or are we good?
My head is blown by all of this. I'm just going to say it, but I do like the fact that we started episode 1 and ended episode 32. I think we're on. So season 1 started and ended on a history episode, and I think that's really cool. Good call out. Yeah. So thanks for listening along on season 1, and we'll see you season 2.
Yeah, we'll see you. We'll all see you then. Okay. Bye.
Bye everyone.